Hi, welcome to Time for Thought. I'd like to discuss something briefly today that's been on my mind lately, and I think is particularly relevant to the circumstances our culture finds itself in today. And that is sense making. And how do we tell the difference between good information and bad information? And I don't mean this in a scientific way, and I don't mean this through a process, but as a gut response, as an individual in our everyday lives, how do we choose what information to accept and what information to reject? Now, there's two particular strategies that I would like to discuss, and I think they're particularly relevant to the position we find ourselves in here in America and in the Western culture, broadly speaking. So, the first is what I like to call information shapes, right? And so, what I mean by this is when you run into information that proves itself to be trustworthy, that information will be built up of informational elements, right, and organized in such a way that they create a set that gives rise to a higher order informational element, right? So let's say we have some premises, we organize those premises in some type of relational way, and they will give rise to a conclusion, right? And when that works well, it gives us a reliable shape that we can use to judge other information with, right? It's not about the content of the information. You can throw off the content. What's relevant here is the shape. And so this might be abstract and difficult to understand. But I would like to call your attention to your experience of music, because I think this is one of the best examples. It's very easy for us all to relate to. If I have you listen to a piece of music and then at some point I press the pause button and ask you whether the next note in that musical progression should be higher or lower, louder or quieter, right? We generally have an instinctual response about that. And that's because music, good music, or enduring music, let's say that, tends to recapitulate these shapes very well. And so you'll notice that musical progressions have particular shapes and relations that we accept and find aesthetically pleasing, and those that diverge from those too greatly, we reject and don't find pleasing and enjoyable. So that's what I mean to a certain extent. And another instance of this is when you encounter information that you think of as profound, when it's very impactful and you feel it, right? Well, profound information strikes you in a particular way because it's communicated to you as succinctly and accurately as possible. It doesn't contain any extraneous informational elements, right? So there's no extra information that's not necessarily relevant to the information you're attempting to communicate to the other. But it also doesn't lack any informational elements. So it's giving you the complete information with nothing more, nothing less. And whenever you hear information stated that way, you'll generally experience that as profound, right? Now there's another thing, an epiphany, and I think that has to do more with the reorganizing of information based on new information that you've received, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you hear something and you know it to be true right away, right? It strikes deep. You feel it. Okay. So some people are more sensitive to that than others. Now, some people are not very sensitive to that at all. And most of these people tend to be fairly effective in the world. They're kind of salt of the earth people. They tend to be more conservative, and they tend to value action over words, right? And this is a little hint at this dynamic here, is they're more concerned about what you do than the information they give you, or you give them. And the reason being is their primary sense-making strategy for pure information is to evaluate the information by proxy, based on your character, right? Your consistency and your actions, right? I can trust this person and the information they give me because the outcomes in their life say that I should, right? So these people are the people who pay attention to, are you consistent? Can I rely on you to do what you say you will do consistently, right? And after that person builds that trust with another individual, they're much more likely to take the information that individual gives them as true and complete and acceptable, right? The problem is, in our society, we are moving much, much, much closer to a pure information society, right? This ability to evaluate information by proxy is really exhausting itself, and especially in the case of the pandemic and lockdown, because if I'm restricted from interacting with other individuals, then I can't tell who I should trust and who I can't. When I only get my information through people in media, right, then I'm generally evaluating personas. And I have no way to find out if those personas are actually durable and consistent in the long run. And so these people find themselves in a very difficult place because they're having to deal with issues in society that are generally of an informational nature and much less attached to their day-to-day actions. And they have to take this information from people whom they can't evaluate the trustworthiness of, right? So we get ourselves in a position where we have so much bad information going around, and nobody quite knows what's real and what's not. And you end up with people believing conspiracies and getting wrapped up in QAnon stuff and everything else. And it's not because these people are dumb. It's that the circumstances of today has limited their ability to evaluate the information that they accept or process and accept. And so I just want to make that apparent. Right? A lot of these people who are promulgating conspiracy theories and not necessarily rigorously tested beliefs are oftentimes people whose ability to tell the trustworthiness and truthfulness of information has been hampered by their inability to test it or to test the people who deliver it to them and evaluate the information by the proxy of their character. So, how do we do something about that, right? What do we do? Because the world is only going to become more information-based. That's becoming pretty obvious, right? We're becoming more and more detached from our everyday action and from our physical actions in the world. And what is being elevated to primary importance is the information that we consume, digest, and then, well, I'm not going to continue that metaphor because it might not go so well. And then what we produce back into the world with it, right? So, as we move towards that type of society, people, even people who are better at telling this, the truthfulness of information as they encounter it, are going to become more and more inconsistent, right? Because this truth is no longer anchored to the world around them, and there's so much of it that it's not only a matter of telling what I should accept and what I should reject, but also what I should pay attention to in the first place, right? So the only strategy that I can see is that as we move forward in society, we have to ground ourselves in our personal experience. We can't abstract everything. We have to test every piece of information that we receive against our personal experience. We have to weigh the odds that this particular piece of information is relevant to my personal experience and whether I can find evidence of it in my personal experience before I do this and engage in this process, because obviously some things you will only encounter by means of information. But I think there are many things that you can look around you and ask, is this a part of my everyday experience? When's the last time I saw that? Does this happen frequently? Right? And re-ground yourself in your physical experience. You have to anchor yourself, tether yourself to the physical world, because we run the risk of floating off into abstraction where we can't tell what's real and what's not anymore. And so I hope that's relevant to some people out there, and I hope that's insightful, at least to some extent. I will talk about why this is occurring in greater detail, and I'll talk about the types and the attentional patterns that are involved. I'd like to talk about cultural type. I'd like to talk about how cultures shift through different types as their hierarchy of values and their attention changes. And then I would like to talk about how after 9/11 there was a very rapid shift in American culture to a particular type that wouldn't have necessarily been as dominant as it is or was if that event didn't happen. And then, due to the inability of our culture to adapt as necessary, because it was suddenly impacted by this event, how we're now going through not a shift in culture, but in an antiodromia, where it's actually becoming its exact opposite. And so we're running into an odd position here, and this is the reason for the divisiveness, is because we have two opposing value sets, completely opposing. They're not a few degrees off from each other, they're completely opposing. And where you fall, personally, in terms of your hierarchy of value, in terms of the attentional domains that you attend to, is going to impact you and land you in one of those groups, right? So, with all that said, we'll talk about that in a future video. There's a lot to cover here. And I'd like to just sum up what I've said in this one by, some people have to see it to believe it. And I think you're seeing more and more in our culture today that some people have to believe it for them to see it. And so as we run into a lot of instances of people rejecting information because it doesn't align with their beliefs, realize that they can't see what they don't believe because they elevate the information to of higher importance than their physical experience. And those people who have to see it before they believe it and won't believe the information that you give them are people who elevate their personal experience above the information that they experience. And so we have to attempt in our society to rebalance these two things. We need to balance our personal experience and the information that the world provides us. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. And I know that it was a little long-winded, maybe tough to track, but I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon.